Welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is focused on strategies for financing implementation of national adaptation plans. My name is Angie Daze, and I am an associate with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, or IISD, which hosts the Secretariat of the NAP Global Network. To begin, I'm going to give a quick introduction to the NAP Global Network. I'll then introduce the agenda for the webinar, after which we'll dive into the content. I think most of you are likely familiar with the NAP Global Network by now, but I'll just give a quick overview for those who are new to the network and our activities. The network was established in 2014 at COP20 in Lima by developing countries and bilateral donors who recognize the growing importance of the NAP process as part of the global response to climate change. We began the network with financial support from Germany and the United States, and since then we've had additional funding from Canada and from Austria. Currently, the network has over 600 members representing over 100 countries, and it's growing all the time. Our goal is to enhance national adaptation planning and action in developing countries. We have three key areas of activity that involve engaging directly with governments and other actors working on or supporting NAP processes. These are sustained peer learning and exchange, supporting national level action, and enhancing bilateral support for the NAP process. And some of the key activities in each of these areas are shown on the slide. In addition, we work on a number of themes that are of interest to adaptation planners and those supporting them. These are areas where we aim to provide thought leadership, drawing on the learning that's being generated through our work with different countries on peer learning and technical support. And you can see some of our key themes listed here. Coming back to today's webinar, it will unfold as follows. I will provide a brief introduction to the process of developing financing strategies for NAP processes. I'll then hand over to Na-Yeon Shin, who works with GIZ's Climate Policy Program. She will provide an overview of GIZ's support on NAP process financing, including methodologies and linkages to NDC implementation. Next, we will have Eric Wallen from GIZ Cambodia, followed by Claudia Haller from GIZ Tajikistan, who will share experiences with NAP financing from these two countries. We'll then have time for questions and answers. So questions are to be submitted through the chat window that you'll see at the bottom right-hand corner of the GoToWebinar control panel. Finally, I'll give a sense of next steps and we will close the webinar. To get us started, I'm going to give a brief overview of what we're talking about when we talk about financing the NAP process. When thinking about the NAP process and what financing requirements there may be, it's really helpful to divide the process into two phases, the development phase and the implementation phase, as you see on this slide here. So the development phase includes those activities related to initiating, coordinating, and maintaining the NAP process. Aligned with the steps covered in the NAP technical guidelines produced by the LEG, this includes launching the NAP process and establishing institutional arrangements, undertaking preparatory activities such as climate vulnerability assessments, developing implementation strategies, which would include a financing strategy, and reporting, monitoring, and reviewing the process on a continual basis. When we look at the implementation phase, this encompasses all of the activities associated with the preparation and implementation of individual actions prioritized through the development phase of the NAP process. So this may include preparation of implementation plans for prioritized adaptation actions, including engagement with stakeholders, comprehensive cost estimates, and preparation of funding proposals. And this phase also includes the actual implementation of the prioritized adaptation actions. So this could involve things like improving access to climate information, strengthening extension services, supporting access to and sustainable management of natural resources that are helpful for adaptation, or investing in infrastructure and technology, such as early warning systems. Across both of these phases, investments are needed in capacity development, institutional strengthening, and stakeholder engagement. I just want to emphasize a couple of key points here. The first is that financing is needed throughout the NAP process, from its initiation to the identification of prioritization of adaptation actions and establishment of monitoring and evaluation systems. There are two main types of costs that need to be covered. The first is operating costs, which are really the ongoing costs associated with coordinating and facilitating the NAP process. This includes things like government personnel, rent, communications, as well as administrative and management costs, like things associated with monitoring and evaluation of projects, programs, and initiatives. When we're looking at investment costs, these are the costs associated with developing and maintaining infrastructure and technologies. This may include construction costs or investments in public goods like education and health. The amount of financing needed to cover the costs associated with the NAP process will really vary from country to country, and the costs will depend on a range of factors. This may include the expected impacts of climate change in a given country, the development context and adaptive capacity, the extent to which adaptation planning and action has already been undertaken, and therefore there are things to build on, and the number and scope of prioritized adaptation actions identified. And while we know that the needs will vary from country to country, we can generally expect that significant financing will be required throughout the NAP process. The amount of financing needed for these two phases, the development and the implementation phase, is likely to differ significantly. So both phases will involve both operating and investment costs, but the nature of these costs will likely differ. We can generally expect that the financing needs will be greater in the implementation phase of the NAP process. This is because of the diversity of potential investments to be made during this phase. It will involve investments at different levels, from local through subnational up to national and potentially regional, in different sectors across agriculture, health, energy, industry, and all of the sectors that have been identified as being important from an adaptation point of view. And as well, there's a wide range of activities that could be undertaken. This can range from strengthening climate information systems to promoting sustainable management of resources to investing in infrastructure. It's also important to note that in the two phases, the financing needs may come from different actors. So in the development phase, we generally expect that most of the costs associated with the NAP process will be borne by government. So this will include the ministry responsible for coordinating the NAP process, as well as other sectoral ministries, subnational authorities, and state agencies. In the implementation phase, on the other hand, a wider range of actors will require access to financing. While this will generally be led by government actors, including both national ministries and subnational authorities, the implementation of adaptation actions will involve a wide range of actors, including community-based organizations, NGOs, and the private sector. So where will the financing come from to cover the different costs associated with the NAP process? There are a range of different potential sources of finance, and we can broadly characterize these into two ways, whether the source is domestic or international, and if the investor is public or private. So the specific sources within these different categories may include domestic public finance, such as national, sectoral, and subnational budgets, international public finance, including bilateral providers, multilateral funds such as the Green Climate Fund and multilateral development banks, and finally, financing from the private sector. Each of these sources of finance has their own characteristics that make them suitable for financing different activities and aspects of the NAP process. So countries will really need to combine financing from these different sources to support the different phases of the NAP process. To enable countries to do this combining of different sources in the most strategic way, it can be helpful to develop a dedicated NAP financing strategy. Such a strategy can play a pivotal role in aligning the financing needs with potential sources of finance. For example, it can help to identify the costs that domestic finance can and cannot cover. The development of a NAP financing strategy should be initiated early within the NAP process and embedded within it. Its content should be tailored to the different needs and adaptation objectives of a country, as well as its human resources and technical capacities. Its development should also be aligned with other national policies initiatives, including a country's nationally determined contribution. And we will hear more about this from Nayan shortly. So if we come back to the NAP process, A financing strategy fits under the umbrella of implementation strategies, which may include a range of different outputs that will facilitate the implementation of NAPs. Now, the process for developing financing strategies will differ from country to country. However, we've been able to identify what we see as the three main building blocks. The first is to identify the financing gap. This involves estimating the full range of expected costs for the development and implementation phases of the NAP process, taking into account both operational and investment costs. This allows calculation of the gap between available and needed financing for the NAP process. The second building block is determining financing options. This involves analyzing the different sources of finance that may be available, including both domestic and international, public and private, as well as potential instruments for delivering this finance to the actors that need it. The third building block involves identifying operational next steps. This strategy should identify which actors will be responsible for undertaking which activities in relation to accessing finance for the NAP process. It should include a realistic timeline with specific milestones to be reached in the near, medium, and long terms. This could include development of funding proposals or engagement of private sector actors. It may also include enabling activities to build capacity for accessing finance for the NAP process. Before handing over to our other speakers, I just wanted to flag that we have a guidance note on financing NAP processes, which was prepared by the NAP Global Network through a collaboration between IISD and GIZ. You can download this guidance in the resources section of the NAP Global Network website. This webinar is one in a series of activities and other outputs that the network is undertaking that builds on the guidance provided in this document. And with that, I will hand over to Nayan, and I will be back at the end of the webinar to take questions and share some next steps.
Thank you very much, Angie. Hello, everyone. My name is Nayan Shin. I'm working for the Climate Policy Support Program on adaptation to climate change, and I'm actually stepping in for my colleague Regina Bernhardt, who was originally announced because she couldn't make it today. So after having heard on why a sound financing strategy is important and have seen the building blocks of such, we will now give a short overview of the relevance of the issue and the linkage to the NDC context before I will move on to some lessons from GIZ experience of financing adaptation and to some concrete approaches the GIZ takes in this regard. So, as we have already heard from Angie, a strategy to mobilize and access climate finance is vital and maybe one of the missing links in moving from planning adaptation action to its implementation. In case the country in question has already an NDC and also a NAP document, it is crucial to combine the implementation of both NAP and NDC adaptation action. In the ideal case, the NAP concretizes and operationalizes the NDC adaptation content. This proceeding can have multiple advantages, especially in the eye of financing adaptation action. For one, the linkage of both NAP and NDC can make efficient use of limited resources by establishing coherent governance structures at the national level and mobilize greater finance for adaptation, thus making NDC-related funding accessible for NAP implementation and vice versa. Secondly, the NAP process aims at allowing governments to plan public investments and to allocate funds according to respective climate risks they are facing. It therefore can help to effectively mainstream adaptation concerns into national budget cycles. And additionally, of course, it avoids the duplication of efforts. We will now take a closer look at some lessons learned from GIZ experience of working in the field. The first lesson learned is that the identification of key actors and key arguments is very important. For example, ministries of finance play the most relevant role regarding finance provision from public sources, so that the NAP financing approach has to follow the cycle of national planning and budgeting. Sector ministries, again, have to be prepared to convince the ministries of finance in budget negotiations on allocations from the national budget to their priorities. Secondly, it is important to have convincing proposals. So the development of bankable projects is challenging, but at the same time, it is key for accessing international funding sources. International funds, but also private investors, they require convincing proposals which build on quantified impact scenarios of climate risks and cost-benefit scenarios of adaptation actions, as well as innovative funding mechanisms. Third of all, close cooperation with the local financial markets is key, as public funds are of course limited and far-reaching investments are required. Private companies' engagement has a strong potential as adaptation lies in their self-interest. They are able to shape adaptation efforts by developing locally relevant solutions, and meanwhile they benefit from improved reputation themselves and get new access to funding sources. However, they can also face potential barriers, such as a lack of awareness of climate risks and their implications on operations and value change. Furthermore, there could be limited availability or knowledge of adaptation options possible, and in case of small and medium-sized enterprises, they might also face financial barriers. So in the GIZ experience, the NAP process gives the opportunity to involve companies and local financial actors to collect the information required for designing innovative financing instruments. The NAP process gives also the opportunity to shape policy regulation and to design cross-sector public incentives for attractive investment environments. The experience also shows that capacity building on the national and subnational level is a key enabler in translating financing needs into action. I will now come to some concrete GIZ support approaches and offers, as the GIZ uses these lessons learned I mentioned before, taken from years of experience in the field of adaptation, to offer a broad support for adaptation planning, financing, and implementation. The support is mainly focused on technical advice and capacity building. And I will start with the capacity building block. GIZ is offering specific trainings to strengthen capacities. For example, we have a NAP country level training and also a climate finance readiness training to support the access to the GCF. The GIZ is also assisting ministries and governments in mainstreaming adaptation and climate risks in their development and planning budget cycles. For example, there are many tools for mainstreaming adaptation and prioritizing adaptation actions, such as the NAP-Align approach, or direct support of NAP processes in many partner countries, such as in Jordan or Vietnam. GIZ is also developing and applying methods for climate risks and vulnerability assessments, including the quantification of climate risks and adaptation investment options at city level and for small and medium enterprises. For example, our climate expert website provides a great platform in this regard, listing tools and trainings. Now I come to the technical advice block on public and private funding. There, GIZ is giving guidance to national bodies for developing their funding proposals and identification of promising cases, for example, for urban infrastructure development. For example, the Felicity initiative, Felicity meaning financing energy for low carbon investment, supports cities and municipalities to develop green energy projects that are eligible for funding. We also support accreditation processes of national entities for the GCF funding, and also support countries in the adjustment of public and private investment criteria and the integration of climate risks. For public investment, we have a project working in Latin America on adapting public investment to climate change. And for private investment, we have the Emerging Markets Dialogue on Finance, the EMDF, tool for analyzing drought risk for private bank portfolios, where the GIZ is cooperating with local banks. You can also access more information on GIZ support for adaptation in general, on specific trainings and tools on our adaptation community website, which you are welcome to visit. Yes, and even though there's already a lot of insight on how to make financing NAP work, every design of a financial approach will, in the end, chiefly depend on the country-specific objectives. So therefore, it will be very interesting to now take a closer look on insights and lessons learned from partner countries. It will be Cambodia and Tajikistan, on how their NAP process and implementation is going on. Thank you very much.
Okay, I hope you all can hear me. My name is Erik Wallin. I am working for the A7, the Climate Finance Readiness Program here in Cambodia, together with my colleague Sukai, who is also sitting here beside me to make this short presentation. Just first to give you a bit of background to the NAP process in Cambodia. I think you have we have heard from the previous speakers a bit already on generally on the NAP process and the different normal work streams and phases, which I think more or less Cambodia is following. In Cambodia, you could say that the NAP process was started in around 2014. It really builds on a lot of existing strategies and policies. The NSTP, which is basically the national poverty strategy, you could say, and then you have the CCCSP, which is the overall climate change strategic plan, which runs up to 2023. There is also already, before we started supporting it, almost a climate finance framework, but that one it's a bit broader than just covering the NAP, and it's rough in the sense that it doesn't give a true sense of the financial gaps and demands and so on. So that is really what we have been working on from there on. Anyway, you will see here that here in Cambodia we have three work streams, you can say, one for short term, one for medium term, and one for long term. I would say that we are very much in on the implementation phase of the NAP process here in Cambodia. So what we were tasked to do was to assist the government to develop a NAP financing framework, which also came to include an implementation plan. I will get back to that. As I said, this really is based on a review of the existing strategic plans and policies, the overall Cambodia Climate Change Strategic Plan, the sectoral climate change action plans of the different line ministries, what we call the CCAPs. Obviously, the Cambodian NDCs were part of it, and as I said before, the previous earlier version of the climate change financing framework. Secondly, we did quite a lot and a deep analysis of financial demands and gaps based on sectoral discussions with line ministries. So you also see that there are put on actually bullets number 2, interviews with line ministries. But so 2 and 3 in combination really was looking into different sectoral plans and with the combined with interviews with key stakeholders within the sectors. Of course, we also had more broader discussions among bigger crowd of people for the multi-stakeholder consultations. Overall, the document of the NAP financing framework and implementation plan here in Cambodia consists of some 150 pages in English and even more in the Cambodian language. But so these conclusions that I show here now are just a few of them. But anyway, the different what we have been looking into, and what really was sort of the starting point, was the sectoral action plans, the CCAPs, and these combined have 171 climate actions, out of which 93 has an adaptation focus. Some has both mitigation and adaptation, but 93 has adaptation focus. What we can see by the analysis that we see an increased spending on adaptation, both from domestic national resources as well as international. But for sure, here in Cambodia, the largest share comes from international sources. I think, if I remember correctly, about 3/4 of the spending is from external financing. Interesting enough, about 85% of these 171 actions have not been implemented so far, and they do also remain largely unfunded. We did an estimation of the total gap, and that amounts to some $865 million. We also looked at private sector engagements, possibilities for that. While we do see some opportunities mainly in agriculture and forestry sectors, so far the engagement of private sector in adaptation financing has been rather limited here in Cambodia. But in order to make this financing framework as useful as possible, we choose to go in the way to give from these 171 actions, we choose 40 actions that we would think are most likely to attract international funding, and made an implementation plan for those 40 actions. So that is how the framework is built. Out of these prioritized actions, then, some 30%, you could say, are in a possibly a near stage of implementation, if funding would be available, that is. And I would also add here that even though we say that they are near implementation, most of them would need quite a substantial additional information in terms of vulnerability assessment and different studies to get the right information on what is on the ground. The majority of the actions are sort of under preparation stage, which then would need even more support in terms of project formulation or program formulation. These are more of idea stage actions that comes from the different sectors. Finally, we have some 10% that we regard more as cross-cutting or sector-wide, which relate more to issues like capacity development and coordination. I will then continue saying something about some important, I think, recommendations that comes out from the NAP financing framework here in Cambodia. One key recommendations is that as it is now, actions are rather project focused and which does not necessarily make them very fundable or bankable. So rather than having this project approach, the government should pursue a more programmatic approach to the adaptation actions. There is a strong need to strengthen project and budgeting capacities. That is goes across all sectors, I would say. There is still a lack of a well-functioning national repository on climate change, science, knowledge, and development. So that needs further support. Sectoral coordination, as I believe many of you will remember it, it's always important, and that is crucial also here in Cambodia, that needs strengthening. Obviously, in order to increase national budget available for adaptation, there is a need to continue to mainstream climate change into ministries' plans and budgets. We from CF-READY and GSZ have done a bit on that as well, but more for sure, much more is needed. And finally, increasing integration of gender dimension in climate responses would be crucial if these priority actions would become a reality. Again, this might be a bit repetitive, what I've already said, but for sure some lessons learned include the issue of more preparation, more support to preparation processes, both institutionally and technically. There is across the board a lack of both knowledge on climate change as such, but also then on project development and budgeting and so on. As I said, also many or most rather adaptation actions require major research and more assessments before they are ready for being even being submitted to order to submit them for funding or for implementation for that matter. Another lesson learned is of course that, so what we did, as I said in the beginning, we started the development of the financing framework with the basis of the sectoral plans, climate change plans. I think that was quite useful, but we also need to take into account other key policy documents, the NDCs, etc., and not solely refer or relate to the sectoral plans. Again, on coordination, I think what we can see that the framework that we have supported in developing really focuses on the national level and less so on subnational level, which might be regarded as a gap. So this horizontal and vertical linkages and coordination between the different levels of government needs for sure more support as well. Obviously, this is for all of us a learning by doing process, and I think it's important to note. We note very clearly in this document, in the framework, that this is not a document or a strategy or a framework that can exist for 10 years or more, but it needs to be revised and updated continuously. Finally, some next steps that we think is crucial. Of course, we would like, now this framework was launched last year in October, so there is still a need to institutionalize the NAP financing framework and to create mechanisms for monitoring the implementation of the framework. Generally speaking, also there is a substantial need to increase knowledge on the NAP process as such among most stakeholders in the country. Coming back to the sectoral climate change action plans that we used and analyzed, these of course will become outdated, and they will need to be revised, and therefore also the NAP financing framework as such and the implementation plan will need to be revised within a few years' time. Of course, if you look at the actions and the implementation plans, which as I said covers 40 priority actions, those would be important to try to kick off and really work on those that are at least a bit like low-hanging fruits, so that we can show that the financing framework is useful for the government mentioned that they are also integrated thoroughly into ongoing and planned government and donor programs. So with that, I will stop and I will hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to present a case study for a financing framework for the agriculture sector here in Tajikistan. My name is Claudia Haller. I'm working for GIZ for different projects related to climate change adaptation and national resource management here in Tajikistan. Yep. In my presentation, I would like to start with giving you a short overview on the general NAP process that is currently ongoing here in Tajikistan. I would then present you in a more detailed way the process of elaboration of a strategic financing framework for the agriculture sector, going a little bit into the current status and next steps. And then in the end, I would like to briefly summarize the lessons learned out of that. So let's start with some background information on the NAP process in Tajikistan. Currently, the government of Tajikistan is finalizing its national climate change adaptation strategy. The aim is to provide a guiding framework on the coordination and implementation of adaptation initiatives and build synergies with other relevant national strategies, concepts, and programs, such as the National Development Strategy, for example. The adaptation strategy includes also in a separate chapter 30 investment projects that were compiled in a participatory approach involving all line ministries. And this whole process was supported by ADB in the frame of a PPCR program. Currently, the governmental approval process is almost finalized, so we expect it to be valid very soon. From GIZ side, within the Climate Finance Readiness Program, we supported this process by strategic advice on funding options as input to the strategy, and here especially by elaborating a separate chapter on financing aspects. The aim of this was giving the Tajik government guidance in planning for accessing and implementing climate finance, because as you might know, Tajikistan is a low-income country and the national budget is quite limited. So the focus is on international climate finance. What we also did, we provided capacity buildings to the line ministries on costing of those investment projects. To operationalize the National Adaptation Strategy, currently UNDP is preparing a readiness proposal for the GCF. There was a stock-taking mission coming to identify the needs, and a proposal including a roadmap for implementation is currently updated based on the feedback. Just to dig a little bit also more into the agriculture sector, I would like to highlight that Tajikistan has a reform program that is valid since 2012, which is actually already, so to say, climate proof. Yeah, so adaptation to climate change is addressed in the program. And what when we started our activities here, had in mind was to operationalize and implement both the adaptation strategy and the reform program by developing a strategic financing framework for the agriculture sector. And this we decided together for sure with the National Designated Authority and the Ministry of Agriculture. So the aim of the strategic financing framework for the agriculture is to support the Ministry of Agriculture in preparing its strategic framework for developing and prioritizing the best financing solutions for climate change adaptation. Here also including the different funding sources, so as we heard in the beginning, public, international, and so on. This way, we wanted to provide strategic advice on implementing the national adaptation strategy in the agriculture sector. We wanted to link it to climate change adaptation. So we wanted to link the financing framework with existing sectoral planning documents like the reform program for the agriculture sector, and support the development of innovative solutions for addressing and prioritizing adaptation issues that are currently prevailing in the agriculture sector and in future becoming more problematic. What we also wanted to do is to support the Ministry of Agriculture in establishing a process for accessing the funding, and here especially, as I mentioned, international climate finance. What was the process of elaboration? As a first step, we reviewed the national context and identified based on these needs. At the same time, we also looked at existing proposals for the agriculture sector. Like I said, these investment projects that were in the National Adaptation Strategy included, but also topics that were mentioned in the reform program for the agriculture sector. This task was done in very close consultation with Ministry of Agriculture and related institutions like the Tajik Academy for Agricultural Science. In a second step, and here, especially in consultation with other international and national organizations and donors, we tried to determine other interesting alternative programmatic approaches or project ideas for adaptation in the agriculture sector. So we went into a interview or consultation phase with other implementing organizations here in Tajikistan. The next step, we identified potential promising funding options and checked then them with the priorities that are outlined in the National Adaptation Strategy and in the reform program for the agriculture sector. As a fifth step, and this is probably the key part of this whole exercise, we then checked these proposals with regard to the investment criteria that the Green Climate Fund and other funding options use, and also considered important factors such as project maturity, readiness, and any country-specific concerns and criteria. Based on this, we advised the Ministry of Agriculture to identify top climate change priorities for the agriculture sector, and also advised on optimal timing and sequencing for elaboration of respective project proposals. And as a last step, we prepared a project concept for one of those intervention options that was identified. This was mainly also a discussion or was mainly agreed upon in discussion with the Ministry of Agriculture, because they were very interested in having also a very concrete output of this whole exercise, so not just a strategy, but already have one formulated project concept. I would probably not go into detail of this slide, just to highlight that, as I said, as an outcome of the interviews with all the relevant stakeholders, we identified 4 potential programmatic approaches to climate change adaptation for Tajikistan's agriculture sector, like microfinancing, water use on irrigated lands, sustainable land management, and value chains. And those are the key areas that were then highlighted as an outcome in the financing strategy. What is the status quo in the next steps? I would call it coming from the stage development to implementation, because we are really at this crucial moment now that the document is finalized, it is translated, we handed it over to the ministry, and now it needs to be implemented. Yeah, so what we try to do to really come from development of a strategy to implementation was to organize a stakeholder consultation meeting with the relevant international organizations and donors in cooperation with the Ministry of Agriculture. This unfortunately could not be realized. But what we were doing then was presenting at least the strategy within the Ministry of Agriculture. We presented it also at a workshop that was organized by the NDA for accredited entities of the GCF. And whenever we heard of discussions, either the NDA or we forwarded the document to potential accredited entities that are about or were elaborating GCF proposals. So what are now the next steps? It's especially the task to create a coherent climate architecture. What do I mean with this? Linking ongoing processes like NDC operationalization, elaboration of a GCF country work program, and the NAP process with what we already started for the agriculture sector. So because at the beginning we had the idea that this whole process that we now piloted for the agriculture sector, we wanted to replicate in another sector and include this then in the end in the GCF country work program. But for the moment, this process, so at the elaboration of a GCF country work program, was postponed. And yeah, all the other processes, so to say, are more or less ongoing in a not perfectly coordinated way, let's call it like that. So the challenge is really bringing this document to life. What kind of lessons learned can we take now out of this process? I would say it's really crucial to focus on a country-driven process. So to involve all actors right from the beginning to secure their buy-in. For example, what we also challenged was when we interviewed other donors that they were asking, why is GIZ doing such a process? So we then always try to include either someone from the NDA or the Ministry of Agriculture into those meetings, so that it's also clear that it's not GIZ doing the exercise, but that we are supporting the Ministry of Agriculture and the NDA. To get the buy-in, as I said, so the buy-in of the national actors, we developed this concrete project proposal to incentivize ownership. That was then also handed over in the end to the Ministry of Agriculture. What I also would say is really crucial is accompanying capacity building at national sector. So here, especially focusing on the NDA, as GCF demands that they are the key actors, that they should really push for being in an active role. So, and yeah, in countries where the national partners are, have not so have more or less a low capacity, it's really crucial to invest into capacity building. What does it mean, GCF, and the role of the NDA? What is also needed is additional capacity building for line ministries on coasting, because yeah, the line ministries in such processes where ideas are collected for implementation need to have at least basic understanding of this, yeah, to then enable attracting international climate finance. And then last but not least, to really invest into intensive in-country coordination. As I said, we have to have a coherent climate architecture so that NDC operationalization, the elaboration of a GCF country work program, and the NAP process is really going hand in hand. With this, I would like to thank you, and feel free to ask me if there are any questions. In the presentation, I also included a link where you can download the financing strategy if you're interested.
Great, thanks to all the presenters. Just a reminder to participants that you can submit questions through the control panel, the GoToWebinar control panel. We've received a few questions, so we'll start, but if you have questions that are coming up, please feel free to send them in and we'll try to cover them. We're going to run until about quarter after the hour, so we'll have time to have a few questions and then we'll close. So the first question is coming from, and I apologize to everyone if I don't pronounce your names correctly. The first question is coming from Dennis Sonwa, and it's looking at the issue of sustainability of finance for adaptation. So the question, it's sort of a three-part question. How to build the sustainability of funding for adaptation, who needs to regularly pay for the adaptation costs, and how to convince stakeholders of the need to cover these ongoing costs. And I'm going to ask Nayan to answer this question.
Yes, thank you, Angie. Yeah, it is a very good and interesting question, I think, and it, in the sense of sustainability and predictability, I guess it's important to point out to the importance of the country-driven process and the importance of ensuring ownership of the process, as Claudia had showed in her lessons learned. So, and I think most countries have initiated an UP process. They have a line ministry coordination. And a key step in adaptation planning is the budgetary alignment, which means, first of all, that countries identify which domestic and international sources can be used, but more than that, they have to mainstream adaptation into their sectoral planning and development plans. So, for instance, if the transport sector has already a budget line and concrete measures in place, the idea here would be to make those climate resilient and thus not generate additional costs for adaptation implementation, and to ensure that all measures in the country are resilient and adaptation is mainstreamed. So here again, it would be important to do capacity development of line ministries, as Claudia had mentioned. And in regard to the question of how to convince them, as a key element would be cost-benefit analysis. And with these stakeholders get an overview of the costs of adaptation measures versus the costs of inactions, which is, of course, mostly much higher. Yeah, and by mainstreaming adaptation in existing budget lines and allocations, these can be used without generating additional costs or burdens to a country.
Great, thank you very much. My next question is for Eric, and I had similar questions coming in from Solveig Schindler and Elizabeth Similton. You mentioned that the main opportunities for private sector investment seem to be in agriculture and forestry. So I'm just wondering if you can mention why that is, and what specific opportunities for the private sector have been identified, and also let us know if any private sector funding has already been mobilized towards the adaptation actions that have been identified.
Okay, thank you for that question. Actually, the Climate Finance Readiness Program, when we supported the process of developing the NAP financing framework in Cambodia, we did not on our own made an analysis of the possible private sector engagement, but used previous already made studies to this effect. Now that study is a few years old now, so maybe things have changed slightly. But I think, at least here in Cambodia, and I would assume in many other developing countries, the reason for saying agriculture and forestry is also because it's also an area where there's a lot of, I mean, the country and the population and the communities are dependent, and there are services on these sectors, and there are already available services, extension services, could be on new crops, etc. So I think it links to already sort of visible engagement by the private sector in those sectors, and that also have a strong possible adaptation focus. Whereas in other areas, let's say, which is a key sector here in Cambodia, water resource management, that's obviously a more public sector related issue normally, I would say, at least here in Cambodia. So I'm not sure whether that really responds to your question in full. I think there is still partly limited knowledge and of possibilities. So I think it's an area where more studies and research is needed. So I think I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. My next question is for Claudia, and it comes from Clémentine Larat. She's wondering, what have been the involvement of the subnational levels of government in the process in Tajikistan, and do they have specific capacity building needs in relation to accessing adaptation finance?
Thank you very much for this question. To be honest, I'm not aware whether subnational actors have been involved. I assume that the Ministry of Agriculture in their process, they checked also the subnational level, but I'm so actively interviewed or whatsoever, this was not involved. The subnational level was not involved. But as a lot of adaptation work, especially in the agriculture sector, is also ongoing really on local level, I assume that, so at least indirectly it was included, because we interviewed all the bigger projects, but also NGOs working here on local level on adaptation in the agriculture sector. So at least indirectly, I would say that it was involved. But yeah, I agree that this is actually a crucial question and task, because so far there is not yet a process installed in Tajikistan for vertical integration, because adaptation is really happening on the ground, but then feeding it back into a national process is not yet set in space. And so one of my key recommendation for this GCF NAP readiness proposal to UNDP was also to include a vertical integration component, because I see this as a key task for also enriching work on national level, and also with work from the field. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to come back to Eric, and I'm actually going to take advantage of being the moderator to ask a question. One of the recommendations that you mentioned was that a sort of sector-wide or integrated or programmatic approach was the preferred way forward. And I'm just wondering if you can talk at all about some of the challenges that may be faced in accessing finance when those types of broader approaches are taken.
Okay, thank you. No, my point with that is really saying that most of the actions that have been prioritized by the different Cambodian stakeholders are really more project type of interventions. They can, some of them I think can easily, or maybe not so easily sometimes, but could potentially be merged with others, creating bigger programs with great impact, and which also might have this more transformational nature to it, which is, you know, as you all know, a prerequisite from at least the GCF that there is some leverage, and there is actually a change being brought to the sector or the country if GCF is ready to support. Now, in Cambodia, as in many other countries, sectors tend, both internally and between sectors, work in silos. So this is of course the challenge to break those silos and to have people from different sectors coming together, sharing and jointly working on joint programs rather than individual projects. And we think that those, if that can be achieved, those more programmatic approaches, the likelihood of Cambodia stakeholders accessing international financing would be much greater. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That brings me to another question for Claudia. I think something that was interesting in the two examples that were presented is that Cambodia has taken more of like a broad approach, looking at across sectors and looking at sort of, as Eric just mentioned, the programmatic approaches, whereas in Tajikistan, the approach has been to focus on a particular sector. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on the advantages and disadvantages of taking a sectoral approach to developing a financing strategy.
Thank you for the question. That's yeah, a very tough question, so to say. I would assume that's that it is easier in terms of stakeholder involvement and harmonization of what should be prioritized and not, to elaborate a sectoral financing strategy. But yeah, I only was part of the sector exercise here in Tajikistan, so I actually cannot compare it with a national wide experience. So that's what I can only assume, because here in Tajikistan, for example, we are also working on other in other fields related to forest and to pasture management and so on, and intersectorial cooperation, as also Eric mentioned, is always a crucial topic, because yeah, everyone is always yeah, at least bringing them on the same table, this organizing an exchange, and then also coming to a joint conclusion. That's not an easy process. So I would assume that a sectoral financing strategy is easier to elaborate, although probably in the end it would be good to have a national, global, or intersectorial wide implementation. But that's then, yeah, more the task of those that are working really on the NAP processes, where we here in Tajikistan have not been working.
Great, thanks very much. My next question is for Nayan, and it comes from actually a number of participants wondering about how we can encourage the private sector to invest in and participate in the NAP process.
Always the difficult question. And one instrument definitely is to put a pricing on climate risks. As I said before, cost-benefit analysis are very helpful to show the costs of action versus non-action, business as usual. And then basically to make a business case for adaptation should be key to give some incentives. So the question has to be answered: what will be the return of adaptation investment, such as avoided damage, savings with regard to infrastructure, etc. And here, as I also said before, the adaptation lies basically in the self-interest of the companies themselves, as they often strongly depend in their value chain on ecosystem services and functioning supply chains. So I think it is extremely helpful to make a quantification and to show them the argumentation based on this pricing argumentation, which is the only logic that this sector follows.
Great, thanks very much. I think I'll have one last question, and I will ask both Eric and Claudia to respond based on the two different country experiences. And it's sort of a simple question, but really difficult to answer, I think. What is Plan B if your government and ministries do not have the funds to lead the implementation phase of the NAP process? And that question comes to us from Christina Downey. And I think we can maybe focus this on sort of key elements of the financing strategies that relate to accessing complementary funds to what would be allocated through domestic budgets. So maybe we'll start with Eric and then go to Claudia.
Okay, thank you. So Plan B, if the government don't have enough resources, well, they don't really. I think that's not the Plan B. It's the Plan A. It's the default plan. It's that the government don't have enough resources to implement it, and therefore I think at least in the short term, Cambodia will be highly dependent on external financing for implementing its NAP process. Whether that is for specific adaptation actions on the ground in the different sectors, or even for that matter for the purpose of capacity development, coordination, learning, exchanges, etc. As I said in my presentation about what we can see, it's that about 25% of the resources being spent on climate change adaptation has come from national government. That will, of course, we hope, increase slightly the coming years, but it will take a long time before the government here is ready to assume the full responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks. Claudia, any thoughts on that?
Yes, so to be honest, the question would be rather the other way around, because Plan A, I would say here in Tajikistan, is to attract international climate finance. Yeah? So as I said in my presentation, the financing strategy really focused on those investment criteria and checking all the adaptation options against those investment criteria to have then more or less projects that could be handed in the medium and long term in via accredited entities to the GCF. So the question is rather how to also convince the national partners that they should also contribute to the implementation of those projects, because we all know that also GCF needs to have at least a share of partner contribution. But yes, there we are working on to try to work on capacity building for the national partners. That international climate finance is always demanding also national contributions. So just fully relying on international climate finance will unfortunately not be enough.
Great. Thanks very much. And I think, this really speaks to this issue of strategically combining the different sources. It's very clear that there is a role for domestic budgets in financing the NAP process, but that those budgets are unlikely to cover all of the costs. And so we need to look at external sources of financing, and also how we can engage the private sector in investing in adaptation. And I think that, that speaks to the need for a financing strategy that really maps the needs to the different potential sources of funding and identifies the best ways to move forward on accessing that. And I think a big takeaway that I heard across the presentations is the need for capacity building of different actors to really engage with access to finance and thinking those options through. So in terms of next steps, just to let you know that we have recorded this webinar and we'll be posting it along with the different PowerPoint presentations that you've seen on our website for reference, and for anyone who's interested and wasn't able to join us today. You will receive a short evaluation survey at the end of the webinar, and it will also be shared in an email to all participants. And we'd really appreciate if you could take just a couple of minutes to share your feedback on this event. I'd like to thank all of the presenters for their super interesting interventions today and for being available to answer questions. I think it was a very interesting discussion. And just to close, if you haven't already, please do join the NAP Global Network on our website, which is shown here. This is open to individuals, and we keep participants up to date on upcoming webinars and knowledge products that are coming out. And that also gives you information on different opportunities to engage with the network, for example, through our country support hub and our peer exchange program. So thank you very much. And with that, I will close the webinar.